Hello, Internet. Good morning. It's Audrey, and this is a Fire and Fiber podcast. I am an Anishinaabe woman, a mother, a social activist, a fiber artist, and this is where I talk about some of those things, primarily knitting and my love of fiber arts. I also throw in sprinkling some thrifting, coffee, books, whatever else tickles my fancy. I'm a mother, a social activist, an avid knitter, and for the last 10 years, my day job has consisted of some sort of social service work in different fields supporting vulnerable clientele, primarily Indigenous folks. I'm coming to you from my home, which sits on the Haldeman Tract in what is now known as southwestern Ontario, just down the river a bit from Six Nations of the Grand River. You can find me on Instagram at Fire and Fiber Makes, and on Ravelry, my name is Audrey Hill, all one word, where you can see my yarn, my projects, whips, whatever. I don't actually really know how to use Ravelry, but I'm kind of learning. So today is, I want to say, day 4 of wearing my hair curly. Finally just giving in, especially as the temperature in this part of Ontario is getting warmer and we're already starting to feel the humidity a little bit. Happy with it for the most part. I didn't wash it today. I just tried to refresh and it's looking okay. It's funny. I feel like each side, like we all have 2 sides to our hair, just the same as we have 2 eyebrows and they're sisters, not twins. So one side is like our type A, responsible kid, super reliable. And then this one is sort of like the kid who, realizes they've forgotten their passport once they're at the airport. We all have a favorite eyebrow, by the way. Everyone does. I don't make the rules. A couple other things on my nails. I am starting to do my nails again. So I have Mooncats Freshly Bitten. I really love these polishes. I have too many. The formula is great. The colors are really fun. The only bummer is they are now subject to tariffs coming into Canada, so I'm not purchasing any right now, sadly. The other thing I wanted to point out, I really have been enjoying this lip business here. So I've been wearing primarily MAC Stone lip liner to line my lips. Obviously, I can't find my pencil today, so we're just going with the lip gloss topper that I normally use, which is Birch by Cheekbone Beauty. First off, the packaging. So Cheekbone Beauty is an Indigenous-owned business. The owner, Jen, is actually from this area, I believe. So it's all Canadian, all Indigenous-owned and Indigenous-focused. I have a lot of their products, and besides the packaging, they're actually really great quality. Cheekbone Beauty is sold online at Sephora, but they're also sold in store in some locations, including my local Sephora. So I've gone there a few times to re-up. I think I'm on my 2nd or 3rd multi-use concealer pencil. I don't know the exact name, but they're great. Actually really wonderful, really, really great quality products, really competitively priced. Their names also are very Indigenous focused. This is the color Birch, for example. Anyways. Apparently, I think this is a beauty podcast. It's not, so I'm going to keep going with what we're all here for. And before I dive into what I wanted to talk about today, I wanted to provide an updated finished object. So this is I don't know if you can see it. This is my Sobble tank. The designer is a friend of mine. Her name is Erin. So on Ravelry is called Curia Knits, Kuriaknits. So this is the Sobble tank, named after everyone's favorite beach in this part of Ontario. So obviously I'm a little biased because she's the designer, but this is a really great tank. I use it more as a layering piece. For me, I'll drop a photo in here. I did wear it to Easter, to our family's Easter function on Sunday. So the yarn I used is Estelle Linacot. I still haven't figured out how we're pronouncing it. Pretty new on the market. It came out this spring, or at least I've sort of seen it in my store this spring. This is the color Sage. I knit mine in a size 7, which called for 570 yards of DK weight. When I originally bought my yarn, I bought 3 skeins, and then I got really optimistic and returned one, as I talked about in my previous video. I then had to go back and repurchase it because I ran out of yarn. Anyways, I have about 86 grams left of the skein that I wound up. I didn't make mine as long as the pattern called for. I think on the pattern, if I look quickly at the photo, it ends up being, I think, a 4 pattern repeat of this diamond lace work. And I think the length here was probably about 7 or 8 inches. I made mine shorter, partially out of personal preference, partially out of running out of time and really wanting to wear it and being a little bit lazy. A few other modifications. I didn't use the recommended needle size for my ribbing. I actually sized down half a needle. And then I also only did 3 rows on all of my ribbing instead of the recommended 5. With the sleeves, I had a bit of trouble picking up the recommended number of stitches. So I believe the pattern called for 114. I picked up 100 and I had absolutely 0 issues because it's designed to be very boxy and sort of not super structured. I was able to get away with it. I already have yarn to make this in another color. I am so happy with this piece. And then if you are someone, so for the pattern itself, it's very well written, lots of photos. If you are someone who prefers written charts, she also took the time to write everything. And then based on the feedback from some of the testers, there is also a side-by-side lace chart, at like a chart tracking chart included in the pattern, which I thought was really great. Just kind of meeting everyone from accessibility, I think, is really important, and recognizing that not everyone reads patterns the same way, not everyone learns the same way, not everyone interprets information the same way. So when designers can provide as much variation on how to interpret the pattern, I think that's great. There's also some video links to some of the techniques used in the pattern. And then I'm talking really fast. In terms of techniques, I really enjoyed doing the lace work, especially for me. I learned how to do this sort of 1/1 left or right leaning cable work. And I actually learned how to do it without a cable needle, which was really cool. So pattern is a good combination for me of meditative and repetitive parts and then challenging parts with the lace work. So it was a good like brain stretch, but an easy knit and an easy read for the most part. So the pattern comes in 9 sizes. I made mine in a size 7 because I really do like things oversized and boxy, but the pattern, actually the measurements go up to about a 64-inch bust. If you've ever heard me talk about size inclusivity in patterns, you know that this hits the marker really well. Because a lot of patterns say they're size inclusive. I talk about that later. Anyways, that is the Sobble Tank by Curia Knits. And I will link her in the show notes as well. I'm off coffee for the morning, so we're back to water. Don't know how I feel about that, but anyways. Ahead of tomorrow, April 26th, which is local yarn shop day. It's also local books shop day, so shout out to Rookery Books in Cambridge, my favorite small book shop. So ahead of local yarn store day, I wanted to do a video that breaks down some misconceptions about knitting, crocheting, fiber arts, the works. For this episode, I am using the term knitting as kind of a blanket term. So if I'm talking about crocheting, fiber arts, I'm probably just going to use knitting for ease of convenience. I'm not leaving out our crocheters, I promise. All right, let's dive on into it. So by the way, I have taken a lot of inspo, meaning I stole this structure. This episode, I wanted to talk about local knitting stores. So I wanted to talk about local yarn shops, but I also wanted to talk about some of the misconceptions around knitting. And so I want to credit Allie Makes Everything. She recently did a really great video on controversial knitting opinions that I thought I really liked the structure of. And I wanted to dive deep into a few more of the things that I feel sort of affected by or that I feel strongly about. All right, misconception number 1. Knitting is for old ladies. So while I joke a lot that I feel older than I am, and I 100% blame parenting small kids, I am in my mid-30s. And so I want to assure you that knitting is not just for old ladies. It's actually seen a revival in recent years across, my glasses are bugging me. So knitting is not just for old ladies. There's been a revival in the last few years where we're actually seeing younger and younger people take up knitting, which is really, really cool. I work at my local yarn shop, so I can tell you right now, I'm often seeing people in their 20s and 30s coming in, either taking a class and learning to knit, or people who've been knitting for a few years and are avid knitters. And so I very much feel like there's more variety when it comes to the age demographic. It's not just little old ladies. And that's also reflected in designers. A lot of the designers coming out right now, or the designers who are making popular patterns, are also a little bit younger. And I think that encourages people to sort of consider knitting in a way that they wouldn't before, especially with the advent of YouTube and things like that. With YouTube, Instagram, that sort of, all these sort of modalities of social media that are typically geared towards a younger demographic. I think also too, the pandemic really encouraged people to take up hobbies that they probably wouldn't have normally thought about. We all remember when everyone was making sourdough bread, right? Okay, so that leads me to misconception number 2, knitting is for white ladies. What I mean is that knitting is for white bodies. Again, for ladies, or maybe I should say knitting is for white folks. Not. So the knitting world is absolutely dominated by white bodies, like many industries, but that is changing. More and more, we are seeing diversity in both content creators and knitting designers and people taking up knitting as well. So as I said, I'm an Anishinaabe woman. My mom and family are from Batchewana First Nations and Garden River, but I would be remiss to not acknowledge the white passing privilege that I have living in a physically white body. This hair, dude. While I very clearly have privilege that has me looking like a white passing cisgendered woman, able-bodied woman, it's really important to recognize that that's not always how people identify themselves. And so knitting, while it has, I think, previously been a very white an exclusively white space, I think that is changing. And so more and more I am seeing, and I actually seek out, but I'm seeing content creators and knitters and designers of color. It's not perfect, but there is a level of diversity that is coming in more and more. And with the popularity of YouTube and the internet and social media when it comes to sharing our hobbies and knitting, I think that has really opened up a dialogue and an opportunity for more content creators, knitters, designers, people who identify as BIPGM, which is Black, Indigenous, Persons of Global Majority. I've been previously using the term BIPOC, which is Black, Indigenous, People of Color, but I recently learned the term BIPGM. Is the knitting world and the fiber world still a white-dominated space? Absolutely, but that is changing slowly. But that's not how it's always going to be. It's not set in stone. Diversity is being pushed forward not only in these groups of creators and knitters, but the average knitter is now demanding more diversity in their content creation, their designers, everything, and dyers, all of it. Some of my favorite Instagram accounts, designers, things like that. Native Knitter on Instagram makes the most beautiful patterns. I have to double check. She's from somewhere, I believe in like southwestern states. So Native Knitter on Ravelry and Instagram makes the most beautiful patterns. Everyone's fave Black Pearl Magic is also knocking it out of the park with different merch and things like that. I would sell my left leg to get my hands on one of those like sparkly neon bags. And my personal favorite newly discovered, to me anyways, newly discovered Indigenous dyer is Bear House Knits from the Comox Valley. So knitting has not always been a white-dominated activity. With the introduction of settlers to the West Coast of Canada in the 19th century, we saw a new art form being developed with the coastal Salish Cowichan sweaters. I'm going to pop a photo in here. These fibers were spun by Indigenous people. These sweaters not only served a utilitarian purpose, but their intricate colorwork and construction is something that has been sought after and heavily ripped off by designers, TNA, Forever 21, all those sort of things. And so the skill, the construction, this art form is still passed down generation to generation within the coastal Salish people today. So that brings me to my next misconception. Misconception number 3 is that knitting is only for the able-bodied. A few years ago, I was in Mary Maxim shopping, probably like 2 years ago, and I overheard someone talking. They were at the pattern desk. They were asking for assistance with something. I was eavesdropping. And I heard this gentleman talk about how he was part of a blind knitting group. And not only was it a blind knitting group, but there was a blind knitting group that really loved to do color work. As a sidebar, I'm using the term blind here because that is what the individual used to identify himself. Normally, I would use terminology like low vision or visually impaired, but with all things, we need to take a person's lead from how they identify themselves. So I'm not being ignorant. I'm just using the terminology that this person used when he talks about being blind. So anyways, it sounds really ignorant, but the thought of being visually impaired or being blind and knitting truly never crossed my mind. So in my true tunnel vision of myself, I never had even thought about people with low vision knitting. So it sort of got me thinking about people crafting who have varying abilities. And so there are literally hundreds of groups online devoted to varying abilities who connect together over their fiber art, their craft, things like that. I was just reading about one group. So there was one woman who's an amputee, and I think she was a knitter before she had lost her arm, but she still continued to knit. She modified it. I really hate the internet most of the time, but it gives me a tiny little hope in humanity for just a minute when I think about groups of people finding each other on the internet and supporting each other, either similar disabilities or abilities, and also crafted together. Like I said, humanity is terrible almost all the time, but every once in a while I have a minute where I have faith in them. As a neurodivergent person who has struggled with severe mental illness my entire adult life, I can't talk enough about how fiber arts and knitting have given my life structure and purpose that was not there before. And so not in the sense of this is my career and therefore my identity because I do this thing, but in terms of stress management, learning to stick to a plan, following through on things, feeling good about myself or my self-worth, because when you create something with your hands, and especially with knitting or crocheting or other fiber arts, you can physically see your process. Immediately, it's so gratifying to be able to see the work that you are doing and making with your hands. And it's, it's happening right in front of your eyes and with your hands. And so as an adult in my mid-30s, being able to challenge myself and use different parts of my brain, learning how to problem solve and be creative has really given my life richness and color. That is second only to the mental health benefits that I've experienced and that researchers have been studying for years that we know knitting, crocheting, fiber arts have on our mental wellness. I think especially, again, coming out of a lockdown world in I don't want to say post-pandemic, but in a post-lockdown world. I can't say enough good things, and I could honestly do an entire video on this, so I'm just going to cap it right here. Misconception number 4, knitting is docile. I struggled with like the wording on this, docile. So I have very strong opinions on things. And the idea that knitting is this sort of passive, demure activity is wild to me. And I was even thinking about this last night when I was at my knitting group. You go to any local yarn store that's having a social and you listen in on the conversations, and you will hear people having all sorts of conversations, challenging ideas politically, talking about social issues, talking about their mental health, talking about their physical health, talking about their stresses, talking about things that you would not associate with knitting, and this sort of idea that we have on a society that knitting is this very like soft, demure, cozy artwork, cozy craft, right? So on the outside, yeah, people are drinking tea and knitting. On the inside, it provides an opportunity for people from diverse backgrounds to have conversations and meet people that they wouldn't otherwise normally. So more than ever, the knitting world today is filled with knitters and creators, designers who align their social and political views with their work. And so I'm not just talking about those really cool chart work patterns that you can make of different like patches and sweaters, like the Black Lives Matter thing. I'm not just talking about that. It actually goes much deeper. So knitting itself is resistance. It resists the idea that we have to be busy all the time and run down all the time in order to be productive. Like, it stops the glorification of busy. It interrupts the hustle mentality that capitalist society has forced down our throats. When we give ourselves time and permission to sit and knit, whether we're whether we're in front of the TV or in very rare moments of silence, we're stopping the glorification of overwork. We're stopping the glorification of hustle and bustle. It's resistance to the capitalist machine. It's resistance to the immediate culture that we live in, where you can order whatever you need from DoorDash, from Amazon, and it's there within a couple hours. I'm not saying that those are bad things. I utilize those services too, but when we expect that, like, I'm going to snap my fingers and have X, Y, and Z immediately, that's a challenge. It resists fast fashion that steals from artists and fills our landfills with discarded items. Knitting is resistance to capitalism and corporate greed. Are there big box stores that sell knitting supplies and fiber? Absolutely. Do they do it like your local yarn store can? Absolutely not. I do want to highlight the cost differential between big box stores and local yarn stores. If you are at a place where you are able to only support your hobby through shopping at those stores, I'm not disregarding that. We all need to make our own choices when it comes to finances, and especially in times like this where, everyone is struggling. I'm not dismissing that. I'm also not dismissing the fact that those big box stores still employ local people in our communities. Regardless of who is sitting at the top of this chain, it's still everyday people in our towns who are working at these stores. And so again, I don't want to dismiss that. I'm just highlighting the difference. When you shop at a local yarn store, a billionaire is not going to space. So instead, a family in your community can put food on their table, an indie dyer is able to purchase more supplies, a small needle company that highlights and prioritizes supporting disability supports in their community can continue to do their work. A sheep farmer can be compensated fairly for their work and can continue to practice cruelty-free shearing processes, and so on. Like I said, I could go on and on all day, but that is my bit about the sort of passive, cozy craft ideal that society has about knitting and fiber crafts. Misconception number 5. And now that I'm looking at it, it maybe should have been bumped into 4, and 4 should have been bumped down to 5, but wherever you go, there you are. Knitting is for skinny people. To be honest, it used to be. If you go to any sort of thrift store that has old knitting pattern books and catalogs, and you flip through, every once in a while, you will come across a plus size geared knitting pattern book. And those are actually still in production today. There's still a lot of designers who focus on just purely plus size patterns, as opposed to looking at size inclusivity for patterns across the board. So more than ever, knitters, including myself, are pushing back on designers who are not size inclusive, regardless of what they say they're size inclusive or not. So to break down size inclusivity, in talking to other people, size inclusivity should hit at least a 60-inch bust measurement. I've seen patterns that go up to 64, 70, 72. And those designers, yes, it takes extra time, especially when you are testing those knits. You have to get more testers. It's a lot more work. Sure. But at the end of the day, a plus size person's money is worth the exact same amount as a straight size person's. Like, our money isn't worth any less. My dollar is still a dollar. And in order to exclude such a big part of the population, it's not acceptable anymore. It's 2020, like, it's just not acceptable. It hasn't been acceptable for a long time. But I think designers are finally starting to get it, especially as new designers are coming on the market who are bigger bodied and saying, like, enough is enough. We don't have to have ugly stuff. Like, I cannot tell you how annoying it is going into a store and going to the plus size section and just seeing ugly potato sack stuff. Like, I joke with my husband a lot that I'm like, God forbid you be fat. You would definitely have no right to be like stylish too. And anyways, so that was my segue. And so something that really grinds my gears is everyone's obsession with a certain European knitwear designer, and the comments I receive from folks when I talk about this person and I challenge that person's idea of size inclusivity. A lot of people will say to me like, oh, well, this designer is now more size inclusive. They go up to a 5X now. Cool. That's like a 5X is the thing about sizing is it's not standard. If you've ever looked at your shoe, for example, there's a US size, there's a UK size, there's a European size, there's an Asian size. Sizes are not universal. Metric and imperial measurements are. An inch in Asia is still an inch in the States, is still an inch in Europe. So a designer can say that they're size inclusive because they include up to a 5X, but what is the measurement on that 5X? I can tell you right now, I've looked at some of these patterns, and I am someone who has a 50-inch bust. I wear about a size 18 waist, like a US women's size 18. And I typically wear, if I'm going based on straight sizes in straight size stores, I typically wear a 1 or a 2X in tops. Okay, just to give you a bit of perspective, 50 inches, 1 to 2X. If I look at this particular designer's patterns, a lot of them I've looked at, the 5X is a 50-inch bust or a 52-inch bust. Okay, what about people bigger than me? Because I am technically mid-size plus size. I'm not really like, when you think about plus size, it's kind of like, I mean, again, it's subjective, but what about people bigger than me? What about people who wear a size 22? What about people with a 60-inch bust? Because those people exist. They spend money on yarn. They want beautiful patterns. Period. End of story. And I know that this designer initially was a child wear clothing designer. And so the branding that goes along with that, the name of this designer, sure, maybe it's talking about small humans, but I am not interested in spending my money on someone who has made their entire marketing shtick, their entire identity on having an adjective in their name relating to being small-bodied. Like, I'm not purchased any sweater patterns. I have purchased a very popular hat pattern. It is very well written. It has really great videos attached to it. Sure, it's a lovely hat. They're very popular. And at the end of the day, that designer is still promoting, consciously or unconsciously, smaller bodies. And until we stop funding these sort of things, until we stop spending our money on those sort of things, until people and designers are forced financially to make a different choice, they're not going to. Anyways, that was a bit of a rant. It's just, for me, it's 2025. This hasn't been acceptable for a long time, but like, there's no reason. There's no reason to keep doing this. Absolutely none. So I get so worked up having this conversation. I feel like I need to like design out. Misconception number 6, knitting is only for women. Okay, let's break this down. For consistency, I'm referring to female identifying people, typically people who are cisgendered, female identifying bodies. That is not my personal belief at all. It's not inclusive language, but for this, we're talking about female folks with uteruses, if you will. So some of the earliest documented records show that there was knitting going on in Egypt in the 1100s. In France and the UK in about the 1500s, knitting was actually an entire industry. So around this time, there were the developments of knitting guilds or knitting groups or knitting unions. So if we think today about our early unions, that was a knitting guild. And it was across the fiber and textile industry. There were different industries that had these groups. So when knitting guilds and knitting groups first came into formation, they were men only, no women allowed. Absolutely excluded women. My husband Nick calls this the original He-Man Woman Haters Club. If you know, you know. And so this was a male-dominated industry for a long time. And in fact, much of the fiber industry was dominated by men until wartime. It didn't really become popularized for women to take up knitting until wartime era, when men were off fighting and women had to pick up a lot of the domestic chores as well as sort of like the man's work. So I wish I had bought it. Actually, there was a while ago, and maybe I'll try to find the photo and I'll pop it in here. But I found an old, I believe it was from the 40s. It was like a Red Cross knitting pattern guidebook for women for knitting socks for the front line, for the Allies during the war. I really wish I'd bought it. It was so cool and it was so delicate. And I'd found it in a thrift shop. And like I said, I think about it all the time and how much I regret not buying it. My point is, this whole idea that knitting is for nice little old ladies is actually a very new idea. And so, yeah, this idea that knitting is only for women, it's only for white women, it's only for the able-bodied, or the conception that there's not space in the knitting world or the fiber world for people of color, people of different abilities, people of different age groups. The fact that there's no space for diversity is something that is being challenged consistently, and it's being challenged in a way where I feel optimistic. Even from a couple years ago, there's so much more diversity in this space, and there are more people seeking it out. Generally speaking, I can be pretty Generally speaking, I'm pretty pessimistic when it comes to the world that we live in, but I am hopeful that the push for diversity continues, as it is continuing in many other spaces. We're not there yet, but the fact is there's still a push, and there's room for everyone. Right? It's not pie. The knitting world is not pie. It's not like if you eat some, there isn't some for someone else. There's room for everyone. There's room for everyone at my table. There's room for everyone at other people's tables. So that sort of sums up some of the misconceptions that I wanted to address, or some of them that I felt strongly about. Again, local yarn store day is tomorrow, and I was thinking a lot about what the local yarn store means to me. I'm a history major, and so when I started thinking about the importance of the local yarn store in our community, it actually reminded me of French salons in the 17th century and the Enlightenment, where people were able to gather and talk about art and culture and social issues and politics and challenge each other in really challenging each other in really meaningful ways. No one is getting up at my knitting social and reading an essay about politics, but you get the idea. So to me, my local yarn store means so much more than just a retail business. I'm also an employee there, so I benefit. For me, when I think about my local yarn store, which I also work at part-time, I think about the emphasis on community. Yes, it is a business. Yes, it is a retail operation, but at the same time, there is so much embedded in the structure of it that fosters community, it fosters growth, it fosters new friendships. My local yarn store hosts a number of socials throughout the week, like most of them do. And when I think about the social group that I go to, I call it my group. It's not my group. There's no attendance. There's no, it's very unstructured. But when I think about the massive impact that group has played in my life. In the past year, there's been a lot of stuff going on with my family, with health and things like that. Sometimes there were weeks where my knitting social from 7 to 9, that was my refuge and my safe place for the week. That was my place where I could go be myself and talk or not talk and get support from people who I wouldn't have met in my life otherwise. And we really only have this one thing in common, but this group and these people have created such a community. Like my shop, the local yarn store, has fostered this level of community and support. And again, it's people that I wouldn't have met otherwise. It's hard to sort of put into words what my local yarn store means to me in relation to the community that it has opened up for me and the doors that it's opened up for me to experience other people and to sit in circle and community with other people. Who, are very special people in my life now that I wouldn't have met otherwise. Both people in my circle that I knit with and people that I work with. It's opened up opportunities for me to meet and have conversations with people that I wouldn't have been able to have otherwise. And it's, the world is really ugly. It's really ugly. And so for me, even being able to step into a space where everyone is there and enthusiastic about the same things and we can just share ideas and lift each other up, it's invaluable to me. And when I think about the sort of institutions or buildings or businesses and community in cities and towns that foster community, when we think about our local libraries, when we think about our local coffee shops, when we think about, all these sort of small businesses, and for me, it's impossible not to think about my local yarn shop and what it means to me as part of my community. And so I just want to say to all of you, happy local yarn store day. I'm Audrey from Fire and Fiber, and I will hopefully see you soon.